Hey class, welcome to Lesson 6, The Cold War and American Consumer Society. This is one of my favorite lessons to teach. I think it's fascinating and I hope you enjoy it. We're mostly going to be covering a very brief amount of time from 1945 to 1953 because so much happens just in those 7, 8 years. So let's get into it. A lot of people kind of debate about when the Cold War actually begins. I'm going to start with 1914, when an author named H.G. Wells writes a book called The World Set Free. And in this story, Wells foresees a world war between Great Britain, France, and the U.S. against Germany and Austria. And so, nothing new there. But what was unique about it was that in the story, the war is fought with atomic weapons. And so that gets people sort of thinking about this as a possibility. And one of those people is a physicist named Leo Szilard, who at the time was living in Germany. And then just as Hitler begins to move himself into a position of authority, he starts reading Wells' story and develops an interest in atomic energy. And ultimately, he gains this belief that atomic energy would allow humans to explore space, open up new possibilities of progress, and essentially, he believes that atomic energy will save humankind. So, as I said, Hitler is coming to power at this time, and Szilard is very reluctant and nervous about Hitler. Most of his friends tell him that nothing rough is going to happen, that Hitler won't really do anything, but he's not optimistic. So he transfers all of his money out of German bank accounts and moves himself to Great Britain and tries to move all of his Jewish friends there as well, out of Germany. And one reason why he wanted to go to England was because he had read that British scientists were actually working on developing atomic energy, but that many of them were very pessimistic about it. In fact, one British scientist said, anyone who looked for a source of power in the transformation of the atoms was talking moonshine. In other words, it's crazy talk. So this set him off, and he started thinking about it seriously. And he remembered a principle in chemistry where if you have a chemical reaction coming in contact with another chemical reaction or a reactant, instead of forming a new center, I guess, of the chemical, it would form two centers or more. And this would cause something called a chain reaction. So he thought if this principle could be taken from chemistry and applied to physics, then we could really get something with atomic energy. And so he starts to develop this idea, and he said that one night, while he was crossing the street in London, he said, it suddenly occurred to me that if we could find an element which is split by neutrons and which would emit two neutrons when it absorbs one neutron, such an element, if assembled in sufficiently large mass, could sustain a nuclear reaction. So around the same time as him, you have another physicist named Niels Bohr, who comes up with the theory of lodging quantum principles within atoms. So electrons orbit an atom. They orbit the nucleus of an atom, but if you add energy to that orbit, then the electrons will change their orbit, or they'll jump and create their own. So every time that happens, every time an electron jumps orbit, then it emits a photon of energy. So this was another breakthrough. And so the chain reaction and this emission of photons in the 1930s lays this groundwork for the creation of the atomic bomb. So let's jump ahead another few years. During World War II, the creation of an atomic bomb is no longer a fantasy, and British and US scientists start working on creating one to defeat Germany. Ultimately, Germany surrenders too soon, but they continue to work on it because fighting is still happening against Japan. So work on the bomb continues, and then on July 6th, 1945 at 5 a.m. These U.S. and British scientists ignite the first atomic explosion, which they called Trinity. And this was in Los Alamos, New Mexico. And this was, I think, probably the most momentous event of the 20th century, if not the history of the world. Everything in the 20th century had been leading up to it, almost everything. I think you can make that argument. And then everything that happened after is definitely influenced by this explosion. So a little bit about the explosion. A scientist from 20 miles away, he was watching the explosion from 20 miles away, said, "The thing that got me was not the flash, but the blinding heat of a bright day on your face in the cold desert morning. It was like opening a hot oven with the sun coming out like a sunrise." And then Robert Oppenheimer, who was the leader of this project, called the Manhattan Project, said this, "We waited until the blast had passed, walked out of the shelter, and then it was extremely solemn. We knew that the world would not be the same. A few people laughed, a few people cried, and most people were silent. I remember the line from the Hindu scripture, Bhagavad Gita, where Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him, he takes on a multi-armed form and says, 'Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.' I suppose we all thought that one way or another." So obviously huge event. There's some debate about whether or not these scientists knew the hugeness, the importance of what they were doing. So 9/10 of a mile away from the blast, people were feeling, not people, but they measured temperatures of up to 750 degrees. And if astronomers had been watching the moon at the time of the explosion, they would have seen the explosion reflected on the face of the moon. So this is one of the biggest coincidences of all time. You had a British scientist who decades earlier had said atomic energy was moonshine. They explode an atomic bomb and you get literal moonshine because the explosion reflected off the face of the moon. So the explosion was huge, big deal. But to the surprise of many, in San Francisco, just a few hours later, the assemblage for a bomb called Little Boy was being loaded onto the USS Indianapolis. So even before Trinity was successful, the United States had already decided that they were going to use a bomb on Japan. So that's sort of an introduction to this. I hope you enjoy this lesson. Again, I think it's very, very interesting and a very big deal too. So enjoy.